In this salient passage, Lewis communicates 4 important things to the reader. First, he defines joy as an unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. Second, he sets joy apart from happiness and pleasure. Third, he claims that a particular experience of joy produces a longing to repeat that same experience. With a little research, I learned that Lewis' understanding of joy was shaped by the German idea, and I'm going to try to pronounce this. As many of you speak German, please forgive me. Okay, Z, like magazine. Zug, like zucchini. Zug, only it's much more guttural when it's pronounced properly. A piercing desire in the human heart. And if Dan was looking last night on the internet where it had a more lengthy discussion of that German word, and it's really interesting and very profound. So it's significant that Lewis chose it to be able to talk about this. And fourth, he says humans have no power to produce joy on their own. This fourth point helps us to understand the title of the book and the line of poetry that Lewis quotes from Wordsworth on the title page. Surprised by joy, impatient as the wind. Joy surprises us because it arrives unexpectedly, leaving behind the stab, the pain, the inconsolable longing. The stab means, as he says later, all joy reminds. It is never a possession, always a desire for something, and I've got the wrong version of this, something longer ago or further away. I'm hoping I made corrections and I've got the wrong one coming up here. So here's childhood memories taken from Surprised by Joy. As I stood beside a flowering currant bush on a summer day, there suddenly arose in me without warning, and as if from a depth not of years but of centuries, the memory at that old house where my brother had brought his toy garden into the nursery. It is difficult to find words strong enough for the sensation which came over me. Milton's enormous bliss of Eden comes somewhat near to it. It was a sensation, of course, of desire, but desire for what? Not certainly for a biscuit tin filled with moss, nor even, though it came into it, for my own past. And before I knew what I desired, the desire itself was gone. The whole glimpse withdrawn, the world turned commonplace again, are only stirred by a longing for the longing that had just ceased. It had taken only a moment of time, and in a certain sense, everything else that ever happened to me was insignificant in comparison. When Lewis talks about his brother creating this little miniature garden on a basic biscuit tin, biscuits are tea companions. They're cookies more like than biscuits. And they come in like what we call a cookie tin. And his brother had just taken the lid, a square lid, and had put moss and twigs and pebbles and created a garden that he brought into the house. And it had that same effect on Lewis. It wasn't the biscuit tin, it wasn't really a sense of garden, but it was this inconsolable longing that was stirred. In the first year's chapter in Surprised by Joy, Lewis recounts 3 episodes from his childhood. The first episode concerns the memory of his brother's toy garden and the sensation of enormous bliss that it produced. The second episode concerns Beatrix Potter's squirrel Nutkin and the intense desire to reawaken the shock that it produced. It made him think of autumn when he read it. And if you haven't read Beatrix Potter's children's books, Peter Rabbit is the one that most people are familiar with, but they're delightful. And she did all the illustrations in them. And you may not know that she was a biologist and very interested in flowers and animals but not allowed into the Royal Academy because she was a woman. So her life is very, very interesting. And the third episode concerns Longfellow's saga of King Olaf and the desire of almost sickening intensity that it produced. And we'll talk a little bit more about northernness that gripped him. Definitely the wrong, I'm gonna have to switch, I'm sorry, just bear with me here. I don't know what happened, but I'm in the wrong version. Okay, this should work better. I saved them identically, and then for some reason it didn't work, and that's me and technology. Okay, so let's go down here. And this is a picture of C.S. Lewis as a boy. It must be Christmas because Santa Claus is on a donkey there. There are not a lot of pictures from his childhood, but that's one. In the first years, Lewis accounts 3 episodes from his childhood. The first episode concerns the memory of his brother's toy garden and the sensation of enormous bliss that it produced. The second episode concerned Beatrice Potter's Squirrel Nutkin and the intense desire to reawake the shock that it produced. The third episode concerns Longfellow's saga of King Olaf and the desire of almost sickening intensity that it produced. Now, one of the things that was also a part of Lewis's childhood that many people aren't aware of is what is called the world of boxing. Half a century before the publication of the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis created another imaginary world. The Tales of Animal Land was the title that they gave it, which 8-year-old Jack, as his family knew him, had shared with his brother Warnie, developed into the Chronicles of the Kingdom of Boxen. In a succession of stories over the next few years, the young Lewis explored its history, geography, and the colorful exploits of its inhabitants in vivid detail. Sounds a lot like the Chronicles of Narnia. Mm-hmm. And writing the last of the papers, his Encyclopedia Boxania, in April of 1928. And this is colored illustrations from their Boxen land, which I think is beautiful. Mm-hmm. The middle figure is Mr. Frog, who's patterned after their father, who was a lawyer. And he's a very important person in Boxen, but very delightful. And again, talking animals, so you can kind of see that connection of imagination that comes forth later when he writes the Chronicles of Narnia. Next, I want to talk about Fantastes. We've mentioned it before. Lewis read it when he was 16. He was taking a train ride. He went to the venue where they sold books, just like we do in the airports today. And he was looking for something to read while he was on the train, and he grabbed Fantastes. Baptized imagination. C.S. Lewis wrote concerning his first reading of Fantastes at age 16, "That night, my imagination was, in a certain sense, baptized. The rest of me, not unnaturally, took longer." And so there's a journey that we're observing here in his coming to faith. Lewis, in Surprised by Joy, would write of that night saying, "It was as if I were carried sleeping across the frontier, or as if I had died in the old country and could never remember how I came alive in the new. I did not know, and I was long in learning, the name of the new quality, the bright shadow that rested on the travels of Anados," and that's the main character in Fantastes. "I do now. It was holiness. It was as though the voice which had called to me from the world's end were now speaking at my side." So he begins to recognize through imagination, through this sense of joy, this sense of longing, that it's connected to something, but he's not quite there yet. The discovery of George MacDonald was the catalyst that began a chain of events in Lewis's life that eventually led him out of atheism and into Christianity. Lewis wrote, the quality that had enchanted me in his imaginative works, speaking of George MacDonald, turned out to be the quality of the real universe, the divine, magical, terrifying, and ecstatic reality in which we all live. And so it begins to come in to real life. As Lewis read more of MacDonald's work, he began to understand that new quality he could never quite put a finger on wasn't separate from MacDonald's faith, but rather was an essential part of it. And one of the things that begins to happen is Lewis discovers that his favorite authors are all Christian. And the authors that he doesn't particularly like are the atheists. And so you can see God through the Holy Spirit drawing him, bringing him forward. In Surprised by Joy, he likens it to a chess game that God is playing with him and moving him along the board. And there's these different components that begin to take place that causes God ultimately to win the chess game. Another important one is myth, the power of myth. Imagination and myth from an early age, C.S. Lewis had a fascination with mythology. He was particularly drawn to Norse mythology, and as a boy he got a book of poetry about Norse mythology, and just something blew up for him, exploded in his imagination. Once as a young man, he saw an illustration from Siegfried and Twilight of the Gods. In one line, the sky turned around. For Lewis, it was enough. Pure northernness engulfed me, a vision of huge, clear spaces hanging above the Atlantic in the endless twilight of the northern summer, remoteness, severity, the memory of joy itself. So there are these moments in literature, in music, in conversations with his new Christian friends, that this joy, this longing that he's experienced since he was a boy, comes into sharp focus and then fades away again. And this is what he's describing. The experience of the power of myth was not an isolated experience, but a recurring theme in Lewis's life and writing. When he arrived at Oxford, he joined an Icelandic study group led by J.R. Tolkien. That was the beginning of their friendship, that required learning Icelandic for inclusion. And this club was called the Cold Biters Club, because in Norse tradition, where they would gather around the fire and there would be a storyteller and the fire would be coal. This is was the name of their club. I can't imagine there were too many people in it. But J.R. Tolkien was a philologist. He was fluent in Old English and those languages associated with it. That was his area of study and teaching. He was so drawn to this pagan mythology that he describes himself later as a converted pagan living among apostate Puritans. I thought that was really funny. So he's moving from an atheist to embracing these kind of religious themes and elements that he finds in this pagan, in quotes, literature, and recognizes that myth has something to do with reality. And I've got one more slide. I'll try to pull it together for you. When Lewis, years later, raised this issue with Tolkien and Dyson, and this is the very famous night where they stay up all night talking, and that Lewis is converted from being a theist to a Christian. So this is kind of the last stage in the story. It led to a crucial all-night conversation. In this discussion, they argued with Lewis that paganism prefigured Christianity, and Christianity fulfilled paganism as suggested in the above quote. They argued that these pagan religions did contain truths and arose out of the structure of reality created by God. These pagan myths were echoes of reality and cosmic pointers to the true myth. The myth becomes fact in Christ. The gospel account of Christ is a story that fulfills these previous stories. The one difference being that the gospel narrative is historical, a true fact. So when I talk about myth, and I talk about, use words like fairy tale and magic, and try to say that the gospel can be expressed through those, and Tolkien had a lot to say about this in his own writing, and in reality, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings is also a fairy tale that Tolkien is using as a genre to tell his story. And that embedded in these stories is the gospel. And both Tolkien and Lewis, George MacDonald, other writers who write fantasy and fairy tales today that are Christian, recognize that these genres enable us to tell a story that may not reach a person that is a Christian, but will reach the pagan and bring them further along in that process. And I don't want to scare anybody away because of the words that I'm using. If you want to explore it further, there's just some rich material embedded in all of this. But because Lewis had this great love of myth going back from the time that he was a boy, and embedded in that love of myth was this joy that he kept sensing that it brought him into. In this conversation with Dyson, Hugo Dyson, one of Lewis's Christian friends, and J.R. Tolkien, made him come to recognize that those feelings, those things that he loved in myth, were true in the gospel, and that led him to become a believer. I love to read missionary stories, and there is a series of stories. I can't remember the title of it right now, but with the idea, and this is an approach that missionaries use, is that when you come to a culture that's very foreign to our English or American culture, you have to learn their culture, and then embedded in the culture, you will find stories that you can then talk about the gospel and begin to preach the gospel. Yes?
Is it eternity in their hearts?
Yes, in eternity in their hearts. And there's actually a couple books on it. They just tell these stories of how people, in preaching the gospel in cultures that are so far away from anything that, in English or American can talk to the gospel. One of our very dear friends who have been working in Papua New Guinea for 39 years, translating the gospel into the language of the Badoka people. And we get newsletters from them, and just this last month, they were translating the out of the Gospels that one needs to forgive others. And this was so contrary to the Badoka people who believe that you never forgive. But how would they be able to understand Christ's forgiveness if they could not be able to forgive themselves? And so there was a lot of discussion around the table when they finally came to translation that helped the Badoka people to understand that principle and made them willing to think in terms of forgiving. So culture sometimes will block the truth, but finding ways to kind of get past that. And again, it goes back to what I talked about last week about stealing past watchful dragons. Sometimes there are these barriers, but the gospel can be preached through these stories and myth making that you find in all cultures. Okay, imagination then was the beginning of Lewis's conversion, an important dimension in his view of other religions and myths, significant to his perception of the world, and an aid in his grasping the meaning of anything. His great capacity for imagination, combined with his extraordinary ability to reason, reveal a key to C.S. Lewis' abiding relevance, and appeal to this increasingly postmodern age where the focus is always too much on one or the other. And a good discussion, maybe it's what we'll work with next week, is that, is Lewis relevant in the 21st century? some 75, 80 years later, are the things that he wrote. I think you guys are a good audience that would nod your head and say yes. You're sitting here in a class learning about Lewis. But I think that's one of the things that has kept me in Lewis, is that I believe that he has something for all ages, from little children to old adults and in between, and that it's a means by which we can communicate important truths. And that's kind of, again, I'll do a little short advertisement for CAM, Cathedral Arts Ministries, that Dan and I are developing right now, is that we believe that literature and the visual arts and music and dance and all of the arts are a means by which to communicate the gospel and to be able to get to people who wouldn't normally listen if you just gave them a gospel track. Okay. Another important issue in his conversion was the emerging contradiction between his reason and his imagination. And I talked a little bit about this last week, about left brain and right brain. Referring to his youthful retreat into fantasy and myth, he says in Surprised by Joy, "Such then was the state of my imaginative life. Over against it stood the life of my intellect. The two hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest contrast. On the one side, a many-island sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless." So some final thoughts. Lewis believed that we do not really grasp the meaning of words or concepts until we have clear pictures or images we can connect with them. Even in the midst of an apologetic argument, Lewis provided just the right picture, image, or metaphor to help the reader grasp the meaning of an argument. And if those of you that have gotten books and you're reading, in various areas of Lewis's writings, you'll discover that. It's a constant, and it's part of his sense that if you're going to communicate to people the importance of the imagination and the need to give concrete examples that help to move people along. And last week I talked about one of the examples he uses, and I can relate to this, that if you have for children, if you have a guest at your home and there's two cookies and one is bigger than the other, and as the host, you take the bigger cookie, there's going to be protest because everybody understands that the guest should get the bigger cookie. And so he uses examples like that to talk to us about our nature. All joy, as distinct from mere pleasure, still more amusement, it emphasizes our pilgrim status, always reminds, beckons, awakens desire. Our best havings are wantings. And one of the things that this joy, these longings that I'm describing, they point us to heaven. And they tell us that this world is not enough, that there's something more that we're longing for. And it reminds me that I'm a pilgrim in this world. This is not the end. And this last quote from The Weight of Glory: "The books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them, it only came through them, and what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. For they are not the thing itself, they are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. Here then is the desire, still wandering and uncertain of its object, and still largely unable to see that object in the direction where it really lies. Heaven is, by definition, outside our experience, but all intelligible descriptions must be of things within our experience. The scriptural picture of heaven is therefore just as symbolical as the picture itself. which our desire unaided invents for itself. From the sermon. So just a couple more quotes. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. We do not want merely to see beauty. We want something else which can hardly be put into words. To be united with the beauty we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, to become part of it. That is why we have peopled air and earth and water with gods and goddesses and nymphs and elves. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek, find. To those who knock, it is open. Okay, so I've got a few minutes, and I just want to read to you a little bit from the Chronicles of Narnia. There's so many places I could go in order to drive this home. And the one that I thought of this morning, and hopefully I'm going to hold this mic here and hold the book, was not the one that I had intentioned to talk about. But you're familiar with the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. And the children are brought into Narnia in a magical way through a doorway. And they are met by Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, which is delightful. I put on a play of the Chronicles of Narnia at Northwest University, and I was in charge of costumes. And I wanted it not to be cartoonish. I wanted it to be as real as I could possibly make it. So I went to the Village Theater in Issaquah, and they had put on a production of the Chronicles of Narnia, and they graciously loaned us costumes. And so I had a Mr. Beaver and a Mrs. Beaver that were delightful. And Fenris, the wolf, who is the queen's head guard, the makeup on him was really tremendous. So much so that after the play, all of the students came out in costume to greet the people. And we had a group of children that came from a nearby school. They wouldn't go near the student that was Fenris. They were afraid of him. So that's when I knew I did it. But I love Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. They are wonderful, homespun, homely people. And the children are there, and they're beginning to talk about Aslan, and this is what they say. "Who is Aslan?" asked Susan. "Aslan?" said Mr. Beaver. "Why, don't you know? He's the king. He's the lord of the whole wood. Not often here, you understand. Never in my time or my father's time. But the word has reached us that he has come back. He is in Narnia this moment. He'll settle the White Queen all right. It's he, not you, that will save Mr. Thomas." "She won't turn him into stone too?" asked Edmund. "Lord, love you, son of Aslan. What a simple thing to say," answered Mr. Beaver with a great laugh. "Turn him into stone? If she can stand on her own 2 feet and look at him in the face, it'll be more than she can do and more than I expect of her." "Well, no. He'll put to rights, as it says in an old rhyme in these parts. Wrong will be right when Aslan comes to sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death. And when he shakes his mane, we will have spring again. You understand when you see him? You'll understand when you see him. But shall we see him?" asked Susan. "Why, daughter of Eve, that's what I brought you here for. I am to lead you to where we shall meet him," said Mr. Beaver. "Is he a man?" asked Lucy. "Aslan, a man," said Mr. Beaver sternly.
Certainly not. I tell you, he is the king of the wood, and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. That you will, dearie, and no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just plain silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Don't you know what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course, he isn't safe, but he's good. He is the king, I tell you. What a wonderful way to talk about Christ. And Aslan is a Christ figure, and for those of you who may not have read the Chronicles of Narnia, later in the story, he is slain on the stone table that represents the law, and he is is resurrected, and so it's this beautiful picture of the Christ's death and resurrection. When Dan and I went to China, I had the opportunity in several places to talk about C.S. Lewis and to read from the Chronicles of Narnia. And I read the resurrection story. And here was a story that was literature, that was fairy tale, but I was reading it to a group of Chinese students. and I was preaching the gospel in that process, something that I could not do directly while I was in China. So it's a good example, you know, of how myth, how imagination, how the fairy tale can work to be a basis by which we can preach the gospel and evangelize. Another one, and I've got a few minutes here still. I'm realizing that I need to get new glasses. I can't read small print anymore. So it kind of swims on the page. But one of my favorite pieces from the Chronicles of Narnia is in the magician's nephew, which is the story of how Narnia came to be. And complicated story how this group of people end up in the very beginning of Narnia, but it's all dark, there's no light, and they're trying to figure out where they are and what's going on, and they begin to hear a voice. In the darkness, something was happening at last. A voice had begun to sing. It was very far away, and Diggory found it hard to decide from what direction it was coming. Sometimes it seemed to come from all directions at once. Sometimes he almost thought it was coming out of the earth beneath them. Its lower tones were deep enough to be the voice of the earth herself. There were no words. There was hardly even a tune. But it was, beyond comparison, the most beautiful noise he had ever heard. It was so beautiful, he could hardly bear it. The horse seemed to like it too. He gave the sort of whinny a horse would give if, after years of being a cab horse, it found itself back in the old field where it had played as a foal and saw across the field loved coming across the field to bring it a lump of sugar. God, said the cabbie, ain't it lovely? Best English I can do. Then two wonders happened at the same time, at the same moment. One was that the voice was suddenly joined by other voices, more voices than you could possibly count. They were in harmony with it, but far higher up the scale, cold, tingling, silvery voices. The second wonder was that the blackness overhead all at once was blazing with stars. They didn't come out gently, one by one, as they do on a summer evening. One moment there had been nothing but darkness. Next moment, 1,000 points of light leaped out, single stars, constellations, and planets brighter and bigger than any in our world. There were no clouds. The new stars and the new voices began at exactly the same time. If you had seen and heard it as Diggory did, you would have felt quite certain that it was the stars themselves which were singing, and that it was the first voice, the deep one, which had made them appear and made them sing. What a beautiful picture of creation in an imaginative way. And this is Aslan singing, and it continues, and it kind of follows Genesis in the separating the light from the dark. But I love this idea of singing. We know that God spoke the universe into existence. What if it was a song that he sang that brought about that? It's just a wonderful, imaginative way to think about the creation. Can I read one more? Okay. Hold on. People often ask me, what's my favorite C.S. Lewis book? And that's impossible to answer. But I can tell you kind of in categories. And of the 7 books of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is my favorite. And at the end of the book, the children have had quite an adventure, as they do when they come to Narnia. But they're now beginning that journey to go back home. And let me read just a little bit. And of course, as it always does, in a perfectly flat place without trees, it looked as if the sky came down to meet the grass in front of them. But as they went on, they got the strangest impression that here at last the sky did really come down and join the earth. A blue wall, very bright, but real and solid, more like glass than anything else. And soon they were quite sure of it. It was very near now. But between them and the foot of the sky, there was something so light on the green grass that even with their eagle's eyes, they could hardly look at it. They came on and saw that it was a lamb. "Come and have breakfast," said the lamb in its sweet, milky voice. Then they noticed for the first time that there was a fire lit on the grass and fish roasting on it. They sat down and ate the fish, hungry now for the first time for many days, and it was the most delicious food they had ever tasted. "Please, lamb," said Lucy, "is this the way to Aslan's country?" "Not for you," said the lamb. "For you, the door into Aslan's country is from your own world." "What?" said Edmund. "Is there a way into Aslan's country from our world too?" "There is a way into my country from all the worlds," said the lamb. But as he spoke, his snowy white flushed into tawny gold, and his size changed, and he was Aslan himself, towering above them and scattering light from his mane. "Oh, Aslan," said Lucy, "will you tell us how to get into your country from our world?" "I shall be telling you all the time," said Aslan, "but I will not tell you how long or short the way will be, only that it lies across a river. But do not fear that, for I am the great bridge builder. And now come, I will open the door into the sky and send you into your own land." "Please, Aslan," said Lucy, "before we go, will you tell us when we can come back to Narnia again? Please, and oh, do make it soon." "Oh, Aslan," said Edmund and Lucy and both together, skip the line. "Dearest," said Aslan very gently, "you and your brother will never come back to Narnia." "Oh, Aslan," said Edmund and Lucy both together in despairing voices. "You are too old, children," said Aslan, "and you must begin to come close to your own world now." "It isn't Narnia, you know," sobbed Lucy. "It's you. We shan't meet you there. And how can we live and never meeting you?" "But you shall meet me, dear," said Aslan. "Are you in our world too, sir?" said Edmund. "I am," said Aslan.
But there I have another name, and you must learn to know me by that name. That was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little while, you can know me better there.
Oh, wow. Oh, my.
Sorry. So I again, complex, what I tried to put together for you today, but I'm hoping that you kind of catch the elements of it and can see it in what he wrote. And you can see it in the Space Trilogy, and Until We Have Faces, and the Screwtape Letters, and The Great Divorce, and any of Lewis's imaginative literature will always lead you back to Aslan, back to the great I Am. And I will end there. We're right on the clock. If you have any questions or thoughts, anything, because next week is our last week, shoot me an email so that I can consider what you want to hear.